Hi folks, Ryan Adams here, Senior Premier Field Engineer for Microsoft. Today I want to talk to you about upgrading clusters. So what I have here is a demo environment, and I'm going to kind of give you a little tour of the environment here, but it's pretty simple. I just have two nodes in a Windows Server 2012 R2 cluster, and I have an availability group sitting on top of that. So something new that came out in Windows Server 2012 R2 is the ability to upgrade to Windows Server 2016. So prior to 2012 R2, if we had a cluster and we needed to upgrade it, there really wasn't a good upgrade path. The only upgrade path would have been to create another cluster side by side, which means if you're on premises, you're duplicating your hardware. If you're on Azure, you're duplicating your VMs and your compute time. In this particular instance here, what we're allowed to do is use the same hardware if we were on premises. Instead of having to duplicate it and have that extra additional cost, we can actually update and upgrade the OS. And there's a couple cool things about this. Now I have an availability group here. Uh, Typically, you're going to want to handle whatever you need to do for the software piece or the application piece first before you get to the Windows cluster. So we'll deal with the AG first here. If this is a failover cluster instance, we would deal with that first using something like the remove node wizard. Now, I'm not upgrading SQL Server. I'm running SQL Server 2017 in this environment here. So I'm not actually doing an upgrade on SQL Server. My suggestion, if you're looking at upgrading the OS and SQL Server, is don't do them at the same time. Do them one at a time. It's much easier and safer to do it that way. If you are going to do both at the same time, I would suggest you take a look at using distributed availability groups is another really interesting way to do that. So keep an eye on that. Again, rule number one, always make backups of your databases. I'm not going to do that here today simply because this is just a test environment. But in a real production environment, before you start any action at all ever, no matter what you do, please, please, please back up your databases. I don't care if you have 64 nodes sitting in a cluster so you think you're covered and 64 copies of it because it's an AG, have a backup. It is the only surefire way that you have to get yourself out of trouble if things don't go as planned. So let's take a look at my environment here. So just taking a look here, I'm right here. This cluster2americans.com is the name of this cluster. So inspecting it a little bit closer at the cluster resources, I can see a couple interesting pieces of information. I can see that the current host server is node 20. As it turns out, the two nodes in this cluster are going to be node 20 and node 21. I can also see that I have a witness. I'm using a file share witness. Yes, you guessed it. That means it's probably running on a domain controller, DC1. Again, just a test environment. Don't ever put anything on a domain controller. Domain controllers have nothing on them other than a domain in and of themselves. But again, test environment, so we're going to break the rules a little bit here. So that gives me a good idea of the cluster and all of its resources. And if I go down, I can actually look at the individual resources themselves. Pretty simple, not a whole lot to look at here. Really the only thing I have here is I've got the cluster name, which is cluster 2. It also represents an object in Active Directory. I've got an IP address, which is a Class A local non-routable range. And then, of course, my file share witness, he's a little off screen down here, is running as well. So let's go in and take a look at the nodes just to verify that. So I can see, yep, sure enough, I do have two nodes, node 20 and node 21. Great. Two node cluster, exactly what I expected. If we wanted to, we could take a look at the cluster. I do have a public network and a private network. You'll notice that on my public network, I do have everything named. Both of these NIC cards on each node has been named public. I always suggest that you name your NIC cards. This is a pretty simple, easy environment here, but as the environment grows, it makes it a whole lot easier to troubleshoot and find stuff if everything is properly labeled and named. I see a lot of things where troubleshooting goes wrong, not because the way and the path of troubleshooting was wrong, but because, oh, I thought it was this and it was actually something else because I didn't have it written down right. So very easy to get confused when you're starting to look at a cluster with a lot of different resources. This isn't one of them. It's pretty simple, but again, best practices, right? So name both of these private for the private network and rename the actual networks themselves. Let's take a look at my roles here. I only have this one single role, AG1. If I look at the resources in this guy, pretty simple what I have as far as resources here. I've got my availability group itself sitting right here. And then I've got a listener, which is a client access point here in the cluster. AG1 is the name. And then I got my 10 dot class A IP address. That is in my public range. So I know I have an availability group running. In fact, if I look at the availability group resource, I'm curious just to make sure. Sure enough, node 20 and 21 are both checked off right here. So that means they are both possible owners. I can fail over between both of those nodes. So what that means as I prepare to do this upgrade, the first thing I'm going to do is document everything. Every single time you do a brand new cluster or an upgrade to a cluster, document everything. I realize it can be a pain. Nobody likes doing documentation. And I'm not talking about writing up a full document of exactly how you go through the steps. I'm talking about what are my DNS names? What are the IP addresses? What are the computer objects? What OU are they in an Active Directory? Do I have rights to those objects? What are my service accounts and what are the passwords for those accounts? I need to have all of that stuff written down. I've already done that. I have all of my stuff written down over here on the side. So as we go through and we make these updates and changes and stuff, I will have all of that to refer to so I don't get anything wrong and everything goes smoothly. So the first thing I need to do, I can see that everything's running on node 20. So let's go ahead and target node 21. Let's do the upgrade on him first. Again, Windows Server 2012 R2 is the OS on both of these boxes. So the first thing I need to do, since I have an availability group, is handle that. So what I want to do is I want to take node 21. I need to go ahead and kick him out of the AG. So we're going to remove him as a replica. Let me go into SQL command mode here. Now in order to do this, I'll actually connect to node 20 because he's the primary. And we're going to tell him alter availability group AG1, remove replica node 21. So we'll go ahead and do that. Super fast and simple. If I refresh over here on the right, expand my availability replicas, I'll notice that node 21 is now gone. Node 20 is the only node that is here. So great, we kicked him out. So that's pretty simple. That was nice and easy to do. If we wanted to, we could connect to node 21 just to see what he looks like. So when we do that, and let me refresh this, I already had him open, so we'll refresh here. Those databases go into the restoring state. So I had 3 databases sitting in my availability group, and they've just gone into the restoring state. So it doesn't get rid of the databases themselves. If you want to get rid of the databases, you'd have to actually go back and do that. The good news is these are essentially, if I want to like just add this replica right back, since nothing's been going on, no transactions or anything like that, it's super easy for me to just go ahead and add them right back if I wanted to, unless you're using direct seeding. Direct seeding, you'd actually have to delete these first before you do the direct seeding. So that looks good, but what about the Windows side of things? Because we haven't made any changes to the cluster itself. So the change we need to make here is we need to get node 21 out of the cluster. We need to break them on out, right? So let me right click node 21. We'll go into more actions and we're going to go to evict. So we're going to evict node 21 out of my cluster. So as I do that, it does give me a warning saying evicting a node can cause problems if a cluster role requires that node. Before evicting it, check it out, make sure everything's good. You know what? We know what we're doing. This is all by plan. That's great. Yes, go ahead and kick him out. So it doesn't take long, kicks him right out. He's done and gone. Now, what we need to do at this point is install Windows Server 2016 on our other node. So I have node 21 sitting over here, and I have the SQL Server CD sitting inside. But what we're going to do here is, and this is the coolest part about doing the upgrade, is I'm actually just going to power this guy down. We're going to reboot him. And then we're going to boot off of the actual ISO. Now, the interesting thing about this is when I do this, I'm not doing a traditional operating system upgrade, right? That's what we would tend to think. So let me go into settings and make sure we're we're set to boot off of that. So I'm going to move my DVD drive up first. So we boot off the DVD drive. I want to insert the Windows Server 2016 ISO. We'll apply those changes, click OK. Go back and start Node 21 up. What's really cool about this whole upgrade process is we're not actually doing an operating system upgrade. In fact, we don't want you to do an operating system upgrade. That's not the way this thing was designed to run. And that's a good thing. It's a very good thing. There's a lot of folks out there that, and I'm just going to kind of walk through the install here. There's a lot of folks that really and truly don't want to do upgrades on OSs or even SQL Server for that matter. They'd rather start fresh and clean just to make sure that everything is all set to go. Okay, well, that's great. We can certainly do that. And what I'll do is I'll put my handy dandy CD key in here. So we'll let that guy run. I want to run the desktop experience because I do want the GUI here. Set my license terms. So this is the part where we're not going to click an upgrade. We don't want to do that. We're going to do a custom install. I'm going to pick partition 4 is where I'm going to stick this guy. We'll click next. So I didn't delete the partition, so it says, hey, look, if there's a previous installation of Windows here, we're actually going to create a folder called windows.old, and we're going to go ahead and put your previous version of Windows in there. Okay, great. So it's going to go ahead and do the install here. Now this is a fresh install, and so what's really neat about this and what I like most about it more than anything else is that I'm doing a fresh install. So we say we're upgrading the cluster, we're upgrading the OS. We're not really upgrading the OS. We actually just wiped it off and started fresh. And that's what I like. But the end result is a total upgrade of the cluster. So this guy's going to run for a while. He's going to install his files and all that kind of stuff. When he comes back up, there's several things that we're going to have to do. We're going to need to configure the firewall. We're going to need to configure IP addresses. We're going to have to rename him, join him back to the domain, all that kind of good stuff because he's a brand new installation. Everything is gone. We're going to need to install SQL Server. It's an availability group, so it's just a regular standalone installation of SQL Server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pause the video while this runs, and then we'll join you right back just as soon as the install is complete. Okay, so we're back now, and where we're at is that the operating system has been completely installed. Now, in addition to that, I've also done a couple of other things. The first thing I did is I needed to configure my net cards. So I went in and configured my network. I'll show you that here. And you'll notice here that I did name them private and public. Again, that's always a best practice that I suggest folks do is name all of your NIC cards. When the cluster starts to get bigger and bigger over time, when you go to troubleshoot the cluster and look at things, it becomes a lot easier to troubleshoot and find things and ensure that you're looking at the right thing when you need to be, if everything is named. So I've gone ahead and named my NIC cards here, private and public. I've given them all the IP addresses, all that kind of good stuff. Configured firewall. Everything's good there. I've also joined it to the domain. So taking a look here, you'll notice that I renamed it from whatever default it does, gives it out of the box, renamed it back to Node 21, joined it back to my Americans.com domain. So the next thing we really need to do is we need to go add the failover cluster feature. So the feature is not installed by default out of the box. Again, this is a feature, not a role. So we'll skip past the role section here. So here we have failover clustering, so I'm just going to check that box off. It says, hey, if you're going to add this feature, there's a few other things you probably ought to add. You should add the failover cluster management tools and the module for Windows PowerShell. We'll go ahead and do that. For those that are not aware, the cluster.exe has been deprecated. Even though it has been deprecated,
it actually still exists. So if we were to check off failover cluster command interface, if you wanted to get cluster exe back, that's what would do it. Everything's going over to PowerShell, so I'm not going to use that. If that's something that you're used to, that's where you can find it. It's still there. Just note that it has been deprecated, so it would definitely be who of you to start learning how to make those changes with PowerShell and inspect your cluster with PowerShell. So we're going to let this thing go through and do its feature installation. Shouldn't take too awful long to do that. So this will get the feature on there, but then what we need to do is actually add him back to the cluster. And when I do that, I'm actually going to go back over to node 20, and I'm actually going to do the add here. So what I'll do is we'll click add node here. You can see there, obviously node 20 is the only one that's in the cluster right now. Now, I won't be able to actually finish this until the feature is installed over there on node 21. We'll go ahead and type in node 21 here. Let's see how it's doing on that feature. So we're still making some progress here on the feature install. So hopefully it'll get that feature done. So you'll notice that we're kind of reversing the process here a little bit, right? So when we decided to upgrade this cluster and we started with SQL Server. As far as tearing down before we build it back up, we had to start with SQL Server, kick things out of the availability group, remove that replica. Then we had to go in and take a look at the clustering side of things in Windows and actually evict the node from the cluster. So when we go to build this back up, we'll actually reverse that process, which is what we're doing now. We'll add the cluster node in first in the OS. Then once that's done, then we can add back the SQL Server part in the availability group. So the good news there too is I've also already installed SQL Server. Again, there was no need to show that, no magic there. It's just a regular standalone installation of SQL Server. There was nothing special that I did other than to enable the always-on feature. So just to show you where that is, you can do that through PowerShell. Super easy to do. That's how I do it most of the time. If you're going to do it through the GUI, we can actually go into SQL Server Configuration Manager. Look at the properties of the SQL Server service, and we can go to the Always On High Availability tab. And this is where we'll just check off that we want to enable Always On High Availability. It looks like it's doing a lot of work here. Taking a second to show that tab. There it is. So all you do is check off this box. And when you check off this box and enable Always On, it'll tell you, hey, it won't take effect until you restart the service. So you do have to restart the SQL service after you do this. By the way, if you do this with PowerShell, the command will restart the service for you automatically. The other thing is it will restart the SQL Server service for you. But of course, agent is dependent upon SQL Server. So when we stop SQL Server, the agent service also stops. It does not restart. You'd have to go in and manually restart the agent service. So that's where you can find that. It looks like the feature installation finished, so we can click close there. Let's go back over here. All right, so we're back to our add node wizard. We're going to add node 21. It's got that in our list there. We'll click next. This is an availability group. I don't have any shared storage, so I'm going to uncheck the add all eligible storage to the cluster. I don't need to do that. This is going to go through and add our node to the cluster. And this is where things get a little interesting as well. While that's running, I'm going to open up a PowerShell window here. Because think about what we're doing right now. Node 21 over here, click on local server, you'll notice that he's running Windows Server 2016. Right, we've already upgraded the OS. If I were to look at Node 20 though, we'll see that he's not running Windows Server 2016. He's indeed going to be running Windows Server 2012 R2 once it loads up here in a second. Right there, Microsoft Windows Server 2012 R2 standard. So have a cluster that is a single node cluster running Windows Server 2012 R2, and I just added a Windows Server 2016 node to the cluster. That's not something you used to be able to do. And that is where the new magic comes in, is that we can now have a cluster with mixed OSs in it. So let's go back to our wizard here. Let's see what that is. So, okay, so it's done. Successfully added the node. Says no appropriate disk could be found for quorum. That's fine. We're using a file share witness. That's already been taken care of. So look, we're good to go. There's node 21. He's back in our cluster. Cool. Other interesting thing to take a look at here too is I'm going to pop back over here to my PowerShell window. And I'm going to run this get cluster. And so we're going to grab the cluster functional level out of get cluster. So let me run that. And what this is going to come back with is nothing. And why did it come back with nothing? And I did this on purpose because what I wanted to show you here is this command works, but it only works on the Windows Server 2016 node. It returns nothing from the Windows Server 2012 R2 node. So if you do go to run this to check your functional level in production, I just want you to note that if it comes back with nothing, right, absolutely nothing, it's completely blank, then you're probably on the wrong node. Okay, well, let's go see what happens over here then. Let's go take a look at our 2016 node. We'll see what he returns from that command and what he tells us. Now, for those of you that are familiar with Active Directory, just to draw a parallel, there's something called domain functional levels and forest functional levels. And that's really the parallel that I'm drawing today. Is it's essentially a compatibility mode. And that's essentially what we've done here is we've got two operating systems in a cluster. We're essentially putting this 2016 node in a compatibility type state. So that would be my parallel. If you were an Active Directory person, you're familiar with domain and forest functional levels. That's probably the closest parallel I could make. If you're into SQL Server, this would be the same as changing the compatibility level of a database to a previous version. Now, if I run that here in this window, I should get some better data back. And what this should come back with is one of two numbers. And so here it's returned and it's come back and it's given me an 8. So 8 means that the functional level is still running at a Windows Server 2012 R2 compatibility level, which means that even though I have Windows Server 2016 and 2012 R2 in the same cluster, I'm not going to be able to use any of the new features or functionality that come in clustering a Windows Server 2016. I won't be able to do that until I update and upgrade the cluster functional level to Windows Server 2016, which would produce a 9 instead of an 8. So 8 is going to tell me Windows Server 2012 R2. Windows 2016 will come back and give me a 9. So we'll come back and we'll check that out later after we've made the upgrade, but we're not quite there yet. What we really need to do is go back and look at our availability group. We just fixed the Windows piece, so I've got the clustering side of things taken care of. What we really need to do is add our cluster node back. So we're going to go in here. We're going to switch into SQL command mode here. Let that guy connect. So I'm going to connect to node 21 and create the login for the SQL Server service running here on 20. Remember, we wiped this whole server. It wasn't an OS upgrade. It was a replace. Right? So we wiped the whole OS out, which means it's a brand new install of the OS and a brand new install of SQL Server. So we need to add this account back just like we did when we first built this availability group. So we'll go in and we'll grab the login. We'll add that back. Next, we're going to go in and create the endpoint. Not going to go over the specifics of the endpoint and doing all that stuff. That's another story for another day. We're just going to create the endpoint. We're going to grant connect on the endpoint to that service account. All right, that ran well. Remember, there's that always on health extended event session. We want to make sure that's going to be running and going on all of our nodes in an AG. So we'll go ahead and get that guy started and make sure he continues to start going forward. And now we're going to connect to node 20 because node 20 is the primary right now. we're going to alter the availability group and do add replica, adding node 21, providing it with my endpoint URL. I'm also providing all the other information you would expect, right? My failover mode, my availability mode, backup priority. I am going to use seeding here, and my secondary role options. So we'll go ahead and run that. That ran well. And then we'll do the actual join. Notice I am granting the create any database. So look, that worked great. Let's go refresh our AG now. Here's our replicas. They're looking much better now. Let's go back over here. Here is the dashboard. And we'll see that, hey, look, node 20, node 21, all the databases are now good. All right, so that's fantastic. So everything appears to be running perfect just the way that I had planned on. Steps that we have taken so far, and I will reiterate these steps and put them all in the blog post, was remove the replica out of the AG on our initial target node, evict him from the cluster, shut him down, put a new operating system on, throw Windows Server 2016 on, reconfigure my network, join it to the domain, figure any firewall settings I need to figure out, add my role or my feature for Windows Server clustering, and then add him back as a node. After we get him added back as a node, then we just go in and add him back as a replica in the availability group. And now we're all back to status quo. So now what I need to do is I need to take care of node 20 because he's still running Windows Server 2012 R2. So I've taken care of piece 1. So let's do this. Let's do a failover. And we're just going to go ahead and fail this guy over to 21, so that way we can target and work on 20 here locally and see if we can't get him upgraded and done and complete our cluster upgrade. Now again, May talked about this earlier. Although you could technically do SQL Server and a failover cluster upgrading both of them at the same time, I don't actually suggest that. The more changes you make at one time, when things go bump in the night, it makes it a little bit more difficult to figure out what's going on and where the issues are. It's much safer to do that one at a time and then go back and do the other one. So that should be all good. Everything should be running over node 21. Looking here at my roles in my cluster, sure enough, we'll see that the owner node is now 21 here. So that's great. Again, I can look at the dashboard. We'll reopen that up just to re-verify where everything is running. So primary instance is indeed node 21. So everything is running over on node 21. He's a happy camper. He's up and running and doing his thing. So everything's running over on node 21. Now we need to target this node. So same thing we did before, right? We need to get rid of the replica first. So we're going to go in, query command mode. We're going to connect to 21 because he's now the primary. Alter the availability group and remove replica node 20. Kick him out of the AG. So that's done. Once we get him out of the availability group, now it's time to get him out of the cluster. So we'll go down here to nodes. Here's node 20. We'll right click just like we did last time with the other node, and we will do an evict. Gives us our warning. Yes, we are doing this intentionally. All part of the plan. So now all we need to do is shut this guy down, reboot him, install the operating system, and reinstall SQL Server. So we'll pause here. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Shut this guy down. Just going to stick in my ISO, do a fresh install of Windows Server 2016, not an upgrade. I am wiping it out completely and starting all over. And then I'll get SQL Server installed back on there, and then we'll continue back and finish out the upgrade. So hang tight, and we'll pause the video here.
Okay, so we're back now. What I did is install the operating system, SQL Server, did all the updates that we would need, so I configured my NIC cards and all that kind of good stuff. So it's time to add the node back, so we'll click Add Node. And we're going to add node 20 back. Again, OS is Windows Server 2016. It's all ready to go. Take care of SQL Server and everything. So we'll click Next here. We'll type in node 20 and get him added back into the Windows cluster. So I'm not going to do that. In your environment, this is something you will want to do. I'm also not going to do the add eligible storage because it's availability grouping on a shared storage. No need to go checking that. So we'll let this run. Only takes a second. This thing's going to go through here and it will add the node back into the cluster. And that'll take care of the Windows side of things and get that back. So we're kind of reversing the process, right? We took SQL Server off first before we took it out of the cluster. Now we're reversing it. You have to put it back in the cluster first on the Windows side, and then we'll add it back as a replica into the AG. So that's done, and we can see that node 20 is here. So he's up and running in green, and everything looks great. So we've got him added back into the cluster. Let's go take a look at SQL Server side of things and see if we can't get it added back as a replica. Now I'm on my domain controller here. Obviously you'd never do this on a domain controller, of course, but because I've wiped the OS off both these servers, I don't have Management Studio anymore. So we're just going to use this as my client workstation in order to go in and add this replica back. Now the one thing I do need to do that I did forget to do is install the OS, installed SQL Server, but I need to actually enable always on availability groups. Two different ways to do this. I'm just going to do the GUI, dirty quick GUI here. Um, Typically, I would use PowerShell to do this. The PowerShell commandlet will actually go through and restart this, right? So when I go through and I click always on high availability, click the checkbox here, and we'd say OK, it's going to say, hey, that's great, but you need to restart the service. So I'll go ahead and do that. The PowerShell commandlet will actually go ahead and restart the service for you. Now, of course, it's not going to restart agent. Agent's going to stop. So if you want to restart agent, you'll need to do that. So the service is restarted, should be good now. Management Studio, of course, wants to connect there through Object Explorer over on the left. So let that reconnect, let it be happy about things. And then we'll go through and we'll have to add the login. This is the exact process as we did on the other node, right? Add the login because we wiped it all, create the endpoint, grant that login, access to the endpoint, go in and turn our extended event always on health session on. Always want that to be on and running. Node 20, we're going to update the availability group until we're adding a replica here, and then we'll actually join the replica and put 20 back into the AG. Great, so everything ran very well. Let's go ahead and take a look at the dashboard here and just see that everything is exactly how we expect it to be. So of course we're looking at node 20, which is not the primary right now, so we'll click node 21 so we can kind of get a dashboard view from its perspective because the primary is the one that can see everything and we want to be able to see everything. Secondaries, when you look in the dashboard, can only see themselves. So it looks good here. Everything's green and clean all the way down. All the databases on both of these replicas look like they're all in green. So good deal. So that is taking care of the operating system and taking care of adding SQL Server and our replica back in our AG. So the one last thing I want to show you here is, although we're technically done with this, I'm going to open up PowerShell here and I want to show you what we can do with the actual upgrading of the cluster itself. So I kind of showed that to you earlier when we looked at what the functional level of the cluster was. So what I want to do here is our last step is verify and check what the cluster level is because both servers are now Windows Server 2016 at this point. So I'm just going to run the get cluster. We're going to grab the functional level out of here. As soon as PowerShell finishes starting up here, the ISE, we'll go ahead and run that and verify it. Now, both servers are Windows Server 2016 at this point. Now, remember, an 8 shows that I'm in Windows Server 2012 R2. A 9 means I'm in 2016. So I get back an 8, but an 8's expected, right? So even though they're both Windows Server 2016, I haven't actually done the upgrade yet. So they're still at level 8, which means I could actually add a Windows Server 2012 R2 cluster in at this point. So I'll go ahead and run the update. Notice it does say you cannot undo this operation. It is a one-way change that is permanent. So once you make this upgrade, you can't add a 2012 R2 node back into this cluster. Windows 2016 from here forward, but it means that we get all those features and functionality are available to us. So let's just check to make sure that we get a 9 back and that it's upgraded it, and sure enough we do. we get our 9 back, that means everything is upgraded and good to go. So that's it. So we've completed a 2-node cluster upgrade. And the great part about it is we wiped the OS off. It was a clean OS install, so we upgraded the cluster, but it was still a clean install. So that went very, very well for us. So that was good. We did not upgrade SQL Server version, but we did handle the fact that we had an availability group on here and the process that we would do that in. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I enjoyed doing this, and we will catch you all next time. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions.